Greetings and welcome to the third in our series on domestic violence, male victims and female perpetrators. We've laid the foundation, we've defined domestic violence, we've looked at a couple of traditional models of intervention. We've cited some of the research that questions the assumption that males dominate as perpetrators. And for today, I want to talk about the concept of the battered male. Perhaps battered husband syndrome, battered male syndrome. I think that we've laid the groundwork for us to see it as more than just a myth, more than just a figment of one's imagination, more than perhaps the perpetrator, male perpetrator's attempts to justify their action. There is no justification for attacking other people physically, emotionally, and other ways. We're looking at the reality that the issue of violence or abuse in the home between, say, partners who are sexually intimate might be a little more equal, even though the public records indicate differently. We looked at the reality that reporting approaches are very different, that men are less prone to report and more prone to endure. One, they can endure it better because they're bigger, they're stronger, and so when they get hit, it doesn't have the impact. We've also looked at the issue of probable cause relative to primary aggressor and the fact that men are probably more prone, if the police get involved, to be seen as the primary aggressor. We also contrasted the concept of, or the reality of, domestic abuse with domestic violence, pointing out that when we look at abuse, which is, in my opinion, categorized relative to very similar behavior but not being reported to police, we see that through surveys and self-reports, women pretty much equal men in relation to being the primary aggressor, if not the initiator, as well as recognizing that there are the realities that they are bilateral. You know, one of the reports pointed out that 50% of the time it was male-females going at it one-on-one. And then 25% of the time the men were the primary aggressors, 25% of the time the female were the primary aggressors. The key is to recognize that when we ask people outside of, or people in general, relative to domestic abuse, which occurs outside of perhaps police intervention, the statistics are very, very different. A surprising number of domestic violence episodes do involve women as aggressors, creating sort of like a new category, and it's called the battered male or the battered husband. And a battered husband or a battered male suffers basically the same emotional, verbal, and physical abuse as a battered wife or female, but is less likely to report these crimes to authorities. And we've already looked at the reasons why. The relationship between a battered husband or male and his abusive spouse can be very complex. A battered husband often employs the same defensive techniques as a battered wife. Now, if you're interested in knowing about the battered, syndrome, here are some of the indicators: denial, withdrawal, and disconnection from friends and families. The shame of owning up to the spouse's abuse. It's kind of hard to own the fact that the person that you love, whether it's a male or female, is hurting you. Equally hard in another arena to admit that you're hurting the one you love. And so a lot of times, just out of shame, one will justify, what's going on. The burning bed is a very interesting rationale for that, as well as some of my dear's most recent work in relation to traditional abuse, just finding excuses. Some excuses may be that in relation to getting back to the male, his own actions triggered her violent response. Well, that sounds like a traditional female response, but please know it is available and used by the male victims also. Or she's only reaching reacting to maybe postnatal stress for those who might have just had babies and are perpetrators. Denial can be a very powerful coping mechanism. We know that. We know that denial is more than a river in Egypt. Especially if the husband dreads the idea of having meaningful discussions with his abusive wife. It's just hard to bear. Another characteristic of a battered husband or male is the tendency to disconnect from his own domestic problems. A battered husband or male will often spend more and more time at work, at the bar, with the boys, with a hobby, outside of the home. Why? Just to avoid the issue. There's a higher probability that he can get out of the home in relation to, caring for the children, et cetera, et cetera. So the battered husband or male will, just stay away from home to avoid potential conflicts. A battered husband may or a male may decide to sleep in the family car or spend his waking hours in a private den or office. Why? Just avoiding contact with perhaps the abusive partner. A violent spouse may also be abusive towards children. At the conference that I attended at the Blackburn Center, we recognized that in relation to violence against children, it was natural and understandable that women were usually seen as the perpetrators. Well, that would also be the case if the female is a perpetrator with the husband. That's what research has shown. And that may happen towards children either in the form of physical attacks or excessive punishments for minor infractions. A battered husband could remain in the abusive home strictly to protect the children, just like a battered female might. A battered husband may also find it difficult to pursue legal remedies or recourse against his abusive spouse. A number of states have domestic violence laws requiring law officers arrest the one that appears to have inflicted the most visible injuries. And that puts the male sometimes at a disadvantage because we know that even when a male pulls a punch, he can do some harm. A battered husband may have been the victim of severe mental or emotional abuse for years, but one defensive slap could tip the balance in relation to the abusive situation. Enforcing a temporary restraining order against an abusive woman or wife could also become problematic in relation to the children if they are involved. So we have, the reality that perhaps there is this concept of the battered male syndrome, and we have sort of like rationale for understanding why the reasons for a man remaining in a battered situation could very closely correlate to the reasons that a female would remain in a battered situation. There's only one case that has been brought to life in relation to a man who was able to use a similar defense of insanity or self-defense. Warren Farrell writes about it in his book, Why Men Are the Way They Are. And on page 31, he talks about the issue of a male who actually sort of responded to his wife by defending himself. Betty King had beaten, slashed, stabbed, thrown dry acid on her husband. She even shot her husband. Eddie King had not sought prosecution when she slashed his face with a carpet knife, nor when she left him in a parking lot with a blade in his back. Neither of these incidents had been reported to the police. There were no records or statistics on the issue. She was only arrested twice when she stabbed him so severely in the back and so publicly in a bar that the incidents had to be reported. All these stabbing, shooting, acid throwing happened during a 4-year marriage. During a subsequent shouting match on the porch of a friend's house, Betty King once again reached into her purse. This time, Eddie King shot her. When the investigation led to a verdict of self-defense, you know that there was an outcry of opposition from many people in relation to the media. But the reality was that the evidence was just formidable in relation to his defense. And, you know, in relation to this case, Farrell reports that a 2-second delay in relation to Eddie King could have what? Cost him his life. On the other side of that, as I mentioned, the burning bed is another example of such an issue, but this time it was relative to a female victim. So it's very important that when we look at the issue of the battered male, that we consider the reality. It probably does exist. It probably is real. In a book on domestic violence, Roger Langley and Richard Levy conclude a chapter on battered husbands by saying, husband abuse should not be viewed as merely the opposite side of the coin of wife abuse. And that's certainly true, because usually husband abuse is often a response by the wife in relation to being a victim. But both are part of the same problem. And it should be described as one person abusing another person. The problem should be faced and dealt with not in terms of sex, but in terms of humanity. And I think they make a good point there. One of the gentlemen in the audience at the Blackburn Center during this conference made a very similar statement. When we talk about all these stabbing, shooting, and acid-throwing incidents, you know, these are just some examples of, you know, perhaps an extreme example of some of the abuse that may be endured by the husband. Statistics show that a number of husbands and men are battered with wives, many times using violence more than the male. The question of why the husband battering has been ignored can be answered several ways. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing. There is no terminology to deal with the problem. There's a lack of information on the subject. Husband beating is less obvious physically than wife beating. If women do abuse, then children are seeing it. But not acknowledging and addressing the existence of wives who abuse their husbands both physically and emotionally. You know, if we do that, our children see it and they learn behavior. Remember, domestic violence is learned behavior. We learn to be victims and we learn to be perpetrators. Well, we are looking at that, realizing it and addressing it relative to female victims. We need to look at that and realize it and address it with male victims, especially if the incidences are very similar proportionately. We don't want our children growing up learning how to be perpetrators or victims. Studies clearly show that mothers abuse their children at higher rates than do fathers. Now, this does not suggest that it's because mothers are, well, it does usually suggest what? That mothers are the primary caregivers. That being said, if the female is abusing in the home, then it puts the children further at risk. In relation to racial implications, black husbands were at greater risk of spousal homicide and victimization than white husbands. But our concern is generally violence done to men. We should not be concentrating our efforts on violence by women to men in the home. Men are frequently the victims of violence, not just in the home, but out in the streets. Men are the victims of violence more often than women in general. There's a wonderful video out. I saw it at the Colorado Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which is basically addressing victims' empowerment. It was called Tough Guys, and it pointed out that the issue of toughness and violence is often correlated with males in general, which means what? Men are going to suffer many incidences. They get their heads bashed in, they get in brawls, they get bashed in public toilets, injured, killed, they suffer higher levels of violence. And then you add to it the violence in the home relative to the domestic issue. When we look at sexual orientation, we know that what? Many studies indicated that a significant amount of the domestic abuse in relation to male victimization was as a result of GLBT relationships. That is yet another issue to be looked at. So we have to realize that violence by wives has not been an object of public concern. In fact, in 1975, Strauss and Gellis's study relative to equaling the playing field, drew major issues, drew major reaction by the population. Now, we can understand that. Please note, we can understand that. Why? Because for centuries, the pendulum was way over here, such that domestic violence or domestic abuse was seen as a private family matter. The concept, the rule of thumb, do you know where that came from? It was an edict in one of the provinces that stated what? A man could hit his wife with a stick as long as it was no thicker than his thumb. After I heard that, I decided I'm not going to use the rule of thumb concept or that terminology anymore. I'm only making that point to say that the pendulum has swung from way over here to way over here in relation to what? Protecting women from domestic violence, and it's very understandable and probably should be encouraged. The point I'm making is that perhaps it's time for this pendulum to get more centered, because the reality of the situation is that violence in the home is violence in the home. And with the advent of technology, with the advent of women's liberation, and the advent of many other wonderful equalizing factors between male-female relationships, we have to realize that domestic violence is not always oriented toward the female victim. And it's just important to remember that, so that as we're moving further into the 21st century, we can be intentional about eradicating domestic violence generically. Therefore, protecting people who are observing it, protecting people who are suffering from it, and recognizing that it's important for everybody involved. As one of the gentlemen said, the battered man syndrome is real. There's very little concern about it, and there's a lot of reaction against the concept. Yet, even with the strong syndrome, we have to, the strong reaction to the syndrome, we have to address it, because our children are observing domestic violence in the home, whether it's perpetrated by the male or female. And if indeed the domestic violence that is perpetrated by females is surreptitious, then our children are even further at risk, because they are realizing, and they may come to what? Believe that what? They are exempt. They are exempt in relation to domestic violence. I think that maybe looking at the contrast between the types of violence that women suffer and that men suffer might be fun. I'm looking at just a summary in relation to what men suffer and what women suffer relative to violence and abuse. The number one type of violence that a woman suffers from a man is being hit or slapped. That's also the number one type of violence that a man suffers from a woman. Number two, push, grab, the shove, the same. Now, men, in relation to the third variable, they suffer something being thrown at them. Women, you still have the slap and their hair pulled. In relation to the fourth one, men being hit with objects, women being beat up. Fifth, men being kicked or bit. For the women, there being something being thrown. So you begin to see a divergence, but In relation to the first couple, they're very much the same. And in relation to the last one, using a gun, they're very much the same. Threatening to use a gun or knife preceding those. So when we look at the type of violence that men suffer and women suffer, they're very similar as far as the top 3 or 2 and the bottom 3 or 2. And it's just interesting, again, to see what? The reality that this playing field is lowered or leveled and that we have to deal with it. Now, here is something that I think is interesting relative to some statistics. In relation to being hit with an object, men are hit with objects at a far greater rate than women. And in relation to a knife being used, men suffer that at a far greater rate than women. Acts of violence in relation to the results of Strauss and Stetz points out what? That it's equal. Hoff says that what? In relation to marital status, doesn't make a difference. But women do report less frequent aggression in relation to a racial issue. And we've already reported that what? There are disparities in relation to males suffering from female abuse. Why do women, if indeed the reality that they are perpetrators, why do they abuse? Why do they accost men? Why do they assault men? Thiebert and Gonzalez, in their 1999 study, along with Strauss and Fienze, pointed out that women hit and strike mainly because they feel that they can get away with it. Now, okay, that's just what the research shows. And another thing too, they found that when males respond to the primary or the initiator, you know, even if they pull a punch, and I had to look up what that meant, even if they're careful about hitting back, they can strike more serious damage than the woman who started the fight. Another one would be what? I knew I would not hurt him. That's another reason why women abuse. They don't think that they're really going to inflict a lot of damage. The Thiebert study pointed out that the partner being insensitive motivated women to strike. They wanted attention. He wasn't listening to me. He was verbally offensive, and I thought it wouldn't hurt. That's the rank. My partner wouldn't listen to me. I wanted attention. He was insensitive, there was verbal abuse, and I didn't think that it would hurt. In relation to other core beliefs, women believe that men can protect themselves. Another issue in relation to the female domestic abuse is that men have been trained very often what? Not to hit women. That's an issue. That's an issue. Feeling of empowerment in relation to women. Some women felt empowered. Learned behavior when growing up. Some women, about 10% in the study, what? Learned to be aggressive. Some women found it to be sexually stimulating, which was very interesting. Some people learned it, what? Modeling the behavior of their mother. And some people saw it as a part of a healthy relationship, and some people learned it from TV role models. But the number one reason was they felt that they could get away with it. When we talk in terms of why men take it, well, socializing and core beliefs in relation to the gender roles. Now, one thing that we found in relation to the mindset of female offenders outside of the family, in relation to female abuse, it's not seen as feminine. Inside the family, non-issue. In relation to outside of the family, women might not hit because what? They're afraid that they're going to be retaliated against. Inside, say in marital relationships, less of a fear. Outside of the family, no need to defend myself against him. Inside of the family, I may need to defend myself against him. So we're looking at some reasons why women do and don't attack. In relation to outside of the family, what? I'm more prone to interact with other women than I am to interact with the man. So what? It might be more prone for it to happen inside the family. In relation to outside of the family, less probability of violent settings. Inside of the family, there's more opportunity to perpetuate it. When we look at female offenders, it's very intriguing to look at sort of like the social milieu that motivates the behavior or demotivates the behavior, and to look at the rationale for, invoking the aggression. When we look at female offenders, we know that the numbers are growing. Why? Because there is an equalization, not just in the technology, but also in the males coming together and just saying, we need to share it, we need to report it. And there's really no shame in addressing issues of domestic violence relative to the men being the victims. This is not the 1800s. This is the 21st century. And men are recognizing we are victims too. The exciting and encouraging thing lies in the fact that the pendulum is beginning to become more stabilized. We went from one extreme to another, and now we're moving to a point where we're becoming more centered and universal in our concerns about domestic violence in the home. It is not only an issue of a male perpetrator and a female victim. In relation to police reports, yes. But when you look at the private lives of families, we are realizing that domestic abuse, where there are male victims and female perpetrators, that is emerging as a private family affair. And it, too, is going to be addressed and recognized as we move forward in equalizing the capacity of both genders to be safe in the home. It is absolutely essential that we continue to seek a balancing in relation to the pendulum, recognizing that atrocity and violence against individuals is unaccepted regardless of the gender of the primary aggressor and the gender of the victim. The final video will actually visit the personalities and the types of female perpetrators. One thing that we've learned, if you're doing intervention for female perpetrators, you have to be very careful because they are coming up to be a unique species. Having said that, I hope that I have whet your appetite enough to join us yet again in this series. Until then, I bid you good night or goodbye.